Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jill Halford and I head up the National Charities team at BDO. I hope you're all keeping well as we embark on our second lockdown of 2020. As many of you will know, this is our fourth charity webinar that we've been doing since March. We've developed this series of webinars to assist our charity clients during this difficult time. And as many of you will know, we usually do these face-to-face, but unfortunately we can't at the moment. If you couldn't attend the first three and are interested in getting a recording, please do let us know, and we can always send you a copy of those ones. So we've got a really interesting session for you today. I've been talking a lot about, obviously, the pandemic and the risks that poses on our charity clients. We've got an estimated £12 billion loss of income over this year for the sector, which equates to 24% of the sector's income, so a huge loss. And I'm often asked the question as to how many of us had a global pandemic on our risk register this time last year. I have had the answer of one, and that was one of my clients who did used to work for the World Health Organization. So I think that's kind of expected. But I'm joined by some great colleagues today. I know them very well. They're going to guide you through a lot of these difficult questions and this difficult area. Quick intros. I've got Sarah Hillary with me. Sarah and I work very closely together. She heads up our Charities risk assurance practice. She's worked with charities for many, many years, and she specialises in risk management and internal audit. And joining Sarah, we've got Stuart May. Again, Stuart and I have worked together for a long time, worked very closely together, and he works with Sarah, advising charities in this area as well. So huge thanks to them both for the session today. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah.
Great, thanks, Jill. So we're going to kick off actually with our first poll. So if you could go to www.menti.com and enter the code 9863707, and you'll see that at the top of the page if you lose it. But we're just interested to know how well did your existing risk register and supporting processes help you in your response to COVID-19? So I see some people are already getting into the groove. Yeah, so we'll just give it a minute and see. We've got 22 responses so far. Okay, slowed down a bit there, so let's stop. So the vast majority of think adequately. That's quite interesting. What's quite interesting there as well is the number that didn't use the risk register at all. 6 out of 38 responses so far, and 5 who didn't use it well at all. So hopefully everyone will find this session of some. Can you repeat the code, please? 9863707. It's at the top of each page as well. So it's just some interesting information for us to have in our minds as we go through the session and think about risk management. There have been questions asked, what is the point of risk management? Did we use it effectively during the pandemic? So I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who's going to start off the main element of our talk today.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the context of the pandemic and what has changed and why we need to be talking about rethinking risk management in that context. So I thought it'd be helpful just to start off by sharing BDO's framework for Rethink, which is effectively a model by which organisations are looking at strategic level discussions around their response to the pandemic, the opportunities and the risks that has presented to them. So it's based on breaking down the Rethink model into 3 R's, the first of which is react. I guess that's the first part of your recovery journey. It's about reacting to the impact of the crisis. And most organisations at that stage looked at assessing the risks to immediately minimise the impact of the coronavirus on your business, on your operations, the employee safety, supply chain, and ongoing financial viability. The next stage, which kind of overlaps slightly onto the RAC stage, is when you move into resilience phase. Now, resilience is all about embedding that resilience into your business, keeping your business running, and working in an environment where you've optimized the way in which you're operating in this changed environment. And thirdly, realize this is where we move into the sort of returning to work phase. We're emerging from the crisis. There's a new environment in place, but which may also provide some unique challenges, but also some opportunities to organisations to rethink the way in which they operate, not just in risk management, but across the entire piece. And we'll talk a little bit more about opportunities a bit later on. Now, I guess just looking at rethink model in the context of lockdown 2, I guess most organisations were probably well into the resilience phase by this stage, but I do wonder how many will be thrown back into the react phase as a result of lockdown 2 and any changes that makes in their ability to continue on the resilience stage of the rethink model. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the risk landscape has changed as a result of the virus. Undoubtedly, the pandemic has changed the risk landscape. Often it's done that by highlighting the increase in the likelihood of existing risks crystallising, and they crystallise as a result of some of the unique circumstances we found ourselves in and the way we're operating. I think what we've done in BDO is we've identified, by talking to our clients, some of the key areas where risks have heightened or changed as a result of the pandemic. I'll go through these briefly. Firstly, around cybersecurity. I think we found through our experience that following any significant global event which disrupts organisations, cyber criminals are actually very quick to seize that opportunity to exploit that sort of uncertainty and to make fraudulent gains. In our experience, we found that COVID-19 is no different. Phishing campaigns, for example, were up and running quite quickly, and it wasn't long before we had experience of that from clients actually experienced those kind of phishing attacks, people clicking malicious links, and obviously the risk around those. Linked to that a little bit is the financial fraud piece, and what we've noticed is that with remote working, some of the usual controls, policies, segregation of duties, etc., have taken, in some cases, second place to operational expediency. Also, to some extent, things like furlough and redundancies have maybe have disrupted the your scheme of delegations. It may have put pressures on your capacity to implement the controls which you've designed to be in place, and put pressures on staff to cope with the workloads. And I think it's important that you're thinking about how effective the controls you have in place are operating in this changed environment. Regulatory compliance. And what we have noted is that in some sectors, some regulators are actually relaxing some of the reporting requirements around compliance. However, what's not changing is your obligations to comply with those regulations in the first place. You're still expected to follow the rules. So I guess the question you need to be thinking about is, are your compliance processes and mechanisms still operating effectively? In a similar way to the financial controls, do you still have people in place to operate them effectively? Have working conditions made it more difficult to get assurance that those are operating effectively? Moving on to data privacy, which obviously links very closely to regulatory compliance. I guess, sort of like it or not, organisations still need to protect personal information, and that's happening in different ways to how it may have happened previously. Remote working again may have increased the risk of data leaks, people dealing with personal data inappropriately, and also actually, COVID-19 has actually increased a number of organisations' reliance on health information about their own employees, and to what extent that those are being maintained and dealt with securely. Performance and reporting. Well, clearly, monitoring, measuring and reporting on your financial and operational health is critical during the crisis as you move into the realise phase. Clearly around revenues, liquidity and cash flow, obviously the very heartbeat of the organisation. Will you survive through that? Operational reporting priorities, I mean, they will depend to some extent on the activities and the purpose of the charity, and in particular around any regulatory obligations or funders requirements in that area. So obviously critical that those risks are being managed appropriately. Scenario planning, which is linked to that. What if scenarios need to be rehearsed? Can you respond to changing circumstances? When you're mapping those new scenarios going forward, can you react to them? And finally, I think something which has affected almost all our clients that I'm aware of is disruption to the supply chain and to contract management, both as the recipient of goods and services and also the supply of services in a charity sense. Obviously, the pandemic has disrupted suppliers and it's affected the ability of many organisations to access goods and services quickly. One thing I was going to add to this section was the concept of risk velocity. What we found in talking to our clients, and it's come up at a number of audit committee meetings recently, is that we are starting to see a discussion around a third variable in assessing risk. And our first two variables you're probably all aware of is around impact and likelihood of risk crystallising. Velocity is becoming almost the third factor in this now. What risk velocity does is it measures how fast an exposure to risk can actually impact an organisation. So effectively, it's the time that passes between the occurrence of the event and when it actually starts to have an effect on your organisation. So I think my view is whether or not you're building this into your formal risk rating mechanisms, I think it's probably important to take account of it somehow, because it will impact your ability to respond effectively to a risk event, because clearly you'll have some indication about how long you'll have to react to it. Now, when I was going through the rethink slide, I was talking a little bit about how rethinking the organisation has sometimes thrown up some opportunities, some upside risks rather than just the downside risks. And we've noted some of our clients have identified a number of opportunities which their responses has thrown up to them as organisations. And what I would like you to do is go into Menti and just using just free text, can you give me an example of an opportunity your organisation has identified as a result of your response to the pandemic? So it'd just be interesting to see if there's any things that have come up. So if you could please go back into Menti using the code at the top of the screen, and as I say, free text responses will be great. There's some good ones coming up already. Great. Some excellent ones coming up there. One of the ones actually which I think is probably covered by the more effective governance meetings thanks to technology. I think that sort of leads into another issue we found, or issue, I should say, opportunity, which has come up in our conversation with clients, is that actually sort of operating in a more agile and flexible way has meant that actually decision making can be a bit quicker, and you can react more in a more agile way to issues. And I think it's helped people understand that those things can happen more quickly without necessarily having face-to-face formal meetings. So that's been really helpful actually, and it's really good to see so many opportunities being identified. Thank you very much for your input on that. So moving on to thinking about horizon scanning and predictable risk. This is where I get my menagerie of animals up on the screen, which is always good to see. Grey rhinos and black swans. You may have heard reference to these in some of the discussions around the COVID pandemic. They represent two different but dangerous threats and many people have suggested that COVID-19 is a black swan event. I just wanted to have a little bit of discussion around it because I think it's quite interesting. The term black swan was coined by the economist Nassim Nicholas Taleb in 2001, and that was inspired by a 2nd century Roman poet who presumed that such birds as the black swan didn't actually exist. He didn't believe it happened. And this term has been applied to a number of risk events which were seen as being outliers, things such as 9/11 or the development of the internet. So what the black swan event is it's commonly defined as an unpredictable event that's beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. They're characterized by extreme rarity, severe impact, and it says here the widespread insistence that they were obvious in hindsight. Now, whether or not that applies to COVID, I don't know. Others think that, some think that the COVID pandemic was actually, to some extent, predictable. Pandemics have happened before; they've been modelled. But I think the argument is amongst a number of writers is that actually the black swan event doesn't apply particularly to the pandemic. Moving on to grey rhinos, Michelle Vucker, a policy analyst who came up with the term in 2012 as a response to the Greek financial crisis, defined a grey rhino as a highly probable, high impact, yet neglected threat. They're not random surprises that can occur after a series of warnings and visible evidence. And I guess we could argue that a global pandemic would fall into this category. I think the grey rhino is really a metaphor for missing the big obvious thing that's charging towards you. And Vucker himself has actually defined the global pandemic as a grey rhino event. So what all this is coming on to is really introducing horizon scanning. Would effective horizon scanning been fruitful in identifying a grey rhino on the horizon? I mean, that's debatable in itself, but what the pandemic has done with a lot of organisations has brought into focus a need to look at the external existential risks, as well as looking inwards at the things which are happening on your own doorstep. So to talk a little bit about horizon scanning, just a few thoughts on why this is important. As you're all aware, the world is a ever-changing, rapidly changing place. It's fast moving. There's lots of disruptive events as we've all experienced, and the fact that we're all so interconnected means that conditions change even more quickly. So, as a result of those things, decision making is more complex than ever, and staying still, to stretch the metaphor of the rhinos and the swans, effectively means you may well be run down by a grey rhino. Horizon scanning can be a really good technique to look at complexity, challenge assumptions about what's happening, reviewing multiple ways that events could unfurl, and ideally, if done properly, could increase resilience and reliability of organisations around those. Exploration of what the future could look like is useful to understand uncertainties better and to analyse whether or not the organisation is adequately prepared for these events or for the potential opportunities which may come up as well. Many tools and techniques are available for horizon scanning. I'm not going to go into those today, but it is something which I think is useful and has become focused as a result of our experience of the pandemic. So, moving on, quickly going to talk a little bit about why agility and dynamism is really important in terms of rethinking your risk management processes. And a lot of clients are actually thinking about whether the pandemic has made their systems, has made them think about whether their systems and processes are actually fit for purpose. And I think the three sort of main things to think about around risk management processes are, firstly, is the process and your risk management structures dynamic and up to date? risk registers are not just things to be prepared for committee review as a tick block exercise. They need to be regularly updated. You need to think about the outputs of horizon scanning. You need to think about other changes and risks emerging from within the organisation to allow you to think about changes to your mitigations around that. Secondly, they need to be embedded and used. Risk management needs to happen in reality as well as on paper. Processes should be embedded within management, and they should be thinking about risk management regularly to help inform decision making at all levels, really. And thirdly, just the other point really is to ensure that they are joined up and consistent. Top level risk management processes need to be supported by a consistent process of managing risks throughout the organisation, and as a result there should be clear processes to ensure that risks can be escalated up when they're identified at a bottom level to be considered at a higher level if they become issues which are going to have an impact on the strategic direction or the objectives of the organisation as their importance increases. So that's a bit of a quick run through the risk landscape, how risk response is important, and horizon scanning. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah to bring us on to thinking about how your experience of the pandemic has made your organisation rethink risk management.
Thanks, Stuart. So what we'd like to do is give you an opportunity to talk together as well about what your experiences have been with your organisation. And there are two areas we've suggested that you discuss. Firstly, how effective were your risk management processes and tools, and what lessons have been learned and what changes have been made in respect of risk management, if any. So you're going to be placed in a breakout room in small groups. Please do unmute and turn on your video if you don't have it on in the group, if you feel happy to, because that way it's better to join in. I'd like to get some feedback at the end of it. So if you could identify someone in your group who might be willing to do that, that would be great. We'll probably only have time for 2 or 3 groups to feedback. But it'd be great to get some engagement around that. We're going to have 10 minutes for this, and it is now 11:55 exactly. So we'll be bringing everyone back at 12:05, and you'll get a 60-minute warning to help you, give you a bit of time to wrap up before coming back into the main room. So with that, I'll let everyone go into their groups, and please enjoy the discussion. Hello, everyone. Well, I hope that you all had a chance to have quite a good conversation and share some of your experiences. Did anybody want to perhaps speak first and share something about what your group was talking about? Can I ask for a volunteer? Catherine? Hi.
Yeah, I think the answer to the first question tended to be actually it wasn't about risk management processes at all. It was about management.
Okay.
And this was an event. It wasn't a risk. So it was actually how it was dealt with and how well it was dealt with by management in terms of reacting to the situation. And I don't think people saw it as directly relating to risk management. I think they're thinking about it now after the event, but not necessarily during the actual impact of it. And that sort of takes on to the second point about the lessons learned and what changes we should be making. And we talked a little bit about actually how we go through our assessment of risk management, whether it instead of just having it as a static annual event, it should be done more frequently on a more dynamic basis, but also actually whether it's going to be feasible to start thinking about what if questions. And the example, a very good example was given by one person in our group was about what if the internet goes down. And for a certain, for certain, for different periods of time, obviously, but what would we do in those situations? Because although it feels like it should never happen, of course, it could easily happen at some point.
Absolutely.
So it's those kinds of things that we perhaps ought to be starting to build into how we think about risk management generally. And some of the processes and procedures we would put in place to deal with that might be existing ones, but we just need to think about how we would react as an organisation. But it's very variable also, depending on the type of organisation. But I think definitely a determination to try and learn from what's happened.
And I think that's where we were coming from a little bit with the points around being dynamic and agile. it isn't something that you just put on the shelf, and how you keep it going. Does anyone else want to volunteer some thoughts from their group? All right, I can't see hands, so if you don't mind speaking out, that would be great.
I can share some thoughts from ours. I mean, quite similar. My name's Charlie. I'm from an organisation called Alpha Kids. Hi. The time went really quickly, so only a couple of us got to speak, unfortunately. But it was, I think, quite a similar experience to what Catherine's described, you know, and what you've said, which is we all know we should probably be looking at these things more often. The reality is, especially working in the third sector, you tend to have bigger things on fire than you know, the luxury of reviewing your risk registers more often. So I think we shared the experience of realizing we need to find a way around that rather than just expecting to find more time for the processes that are already in place. So one of the things that my organisation is doing is just trying to put more capacity on it. We're a small team. We don't have risk management staff or even operational staff dedicated to this stuff. So it's just fitting it in. And when crisis hits, you know, everybody's capacity is overstretched anyway. So we're bringing in risk and audit committees and just more people to take smaller slices of the responsibility, and hopefully be looking at it on a more regular basis, and even just having more heads on you know, on the process of what ifing and thinking through risks in the first place, rather than relying on a couple of people just to think of everything.
And I think that is one of the benefits you can get from people sitting on a risk or audit committee, is that independent perspective. So they're not in the thick of it, but they can kind of look around it or above it and kind of say, oh, but what about this? What if that? And throw some other thoughts out there and just give you another perspective. That's good.
And just to add, the other thing that sort of came out of our group was perhaps having prioritised strategic risks or impact on strategy, and organisational impact, and perhaps not so much focus on the day-to-day operational risks, which of course this has disrupted. So exactly as you say, thinking through the whole big picture.
Excellent. Thank you both for sharing that. In the interest of time, I will move on, but I hope that you all did get something out of those conversations and opportunity to share. So what we're going to talk about next is actually some risk tools. And in your sessions, you did have that opportunity to think about what tools you might use and how useful they were. And in our experience, we found from talking to clients that those that had some kind of software tool that they used to support them with risk management found that more useful possibly than some of those people who just rely on spreadsheets. So if you think about the world we live in, which some people describe as a VUCA world, you know, it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. So the more that we can do to help us anticipate and understand consequences and then prepare, the better. So if we have a tool, what the benefits are, it gives us that real-time information, which helps us be more dynamic in managing risk. I think the cross dependencies point that's here as the second point is really useful as well, because if you think about key controls that you might have in your organization, you're quite likely to find that they are helping to mitigate more than one risk. So if a risk crystallizes, having that ability to cross-link will highlight where other risks are being impacted as well. Everything is pretty multi-layered these days. It's not normally one single outcome. We've also got, it also helps with management and accountability, so you can see who is doing what and who's responsible for what, and gives us that robust audit trail. At BDO, we use a tool called Reza, which is available to clients as well, but also to demonstrate that we practice what we preach. This can work for large or small clients actually, but what it does is it just gives you those dashboards so you can see at a glance where things stand and where you might need to be taking action. So I don't have a lot of time to tell you more about that, but if you did want to know anything about these tools, I'd be happy to talk to you about that separate conversation. The final part that we're going to talk about today, before we go to questions, is risk appetite and rethinking risk appetite. this is an area that boards can sometimes find quite complex to articulate and to really feel that they understand and can test it. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is risk appetite? Well, our definition that we're using here from the ISO guide is the amount and type of risk that an organisation is willing to pursue or retain. What it does is it helps us by limiting the organisation from taking excessive risk, but it also empowers us to take risk. And that's really valuable. So it gives us those parameters in which we can work. And I thought it'd be helpful just to talk about some examples that, of where risk appetite, we're seeing it in practice. I think one of the things we're seeing is that some organisations are actually less risk averse than they had thought they were, because they're prepared to take more risk and they've had to be more agile in their decision making. So for example, if you look at it at a macro level and you look at the pandemic journey, there was no appetite for risk when the whole country went into lockdown back in March. But the decisions to relax restrictions being underpinned by a change in risk appetite, and in terms of what the last few months have shown us and the importance of agility to change and to flex and to think about risk appetite in terms of timely decision making and how we all respond to that. Another example that we've seen from our clients are those, for example, that do grant funding. So charities that provide grants, a number of them have changed their due diligence process for providing grants. The risk appetite has changed to let them get money out there more quickly and to actually get it to the beneficiaries. So what we're seeing is that they are moving from having a preventative approach to one which is more of a detective controls approach. So basically now they've got the money out there, they're following up to ensure that it's got to the right recipient and being spent on the right things. But they had to change their risk appetite in terms of the front end of that process. Another example comes from a regulator and how they flexed their risk appetite when considering the impact they have on those that they're regulating. And the scenario here is where something goes wrong and how they take forward their usual regulatory or disciplinary action within a public safety environment. So the risk for them is that they need to be seen to be taking proportionate and appropriate action, but they also have to be aware of the wider environment and the context in which they're doing that. So in this case, what the regulator did was they extended and delayed their timeframe for acting. And they're now also looking at whether this perception of reputation risk their own perception of reputation risk might actually be too rigid. And they're considering changing their risk appetite in that sense on a permanent basis. So that's kind of examples of where people are looking at their agility in terms of risk appetite and flexing it and changing it depending on the circumstances. And it might be, I'm sure the Charity Commission as well is looking at some of this in terms of how they're working with the charities that they're regulating. So we've got one more Menti question, poll question, before we move to the end of our session. And if you could all go back onto menti.com, the code is up there at the top, and give us your thoughts. So there's a fair few people there that have suggesting that they've become less risk averse as well. And I think maybe if you were to think back at some of the decision making that's gone on and think about how you've done that, you may not have been thinking risk appetite at the time, but if you reflect back on it, you might think actually we did flex it somewhat. Shall we move on to the last slide, Stuart? So what are our takeaways from this session for you? Firstly, and I think from the feedback from the groups, this has come up as well, this point about making sure that your risk register can be more dynamic, more agile, and that might work better for you. So we've asked the question, is it time to review yours? I think the importance of horizon scanning as well has come out. It's a big lesson learned from risk management, and doing that what if scenario testing. It's really important. I mean, you're quite right. The internet could go down, and how long or how significant would that have to be for it to have an impact on your organisation? And finally, do you need to rethink your risk appetite, or actually are you really doing that anyway, but not necessarily thinking about it in that way? But it's just thinking, has our appetite for risk changed, where we have kind of made decisions that we might not have made before the pandemic, or that we were forced to make? Actually, if you reflect back, does that mean we could do that all the time and be more efficient, more cost effective? Do we really need to go back to how we were doing things before? And if you think about that as well in the context of risk appetite, risk management, that could be interesting. Okay, so I think we've got a few minutes available to take some questions, and Jill's going to help us facilitate that.
We do, Sarah. Thank you. Thanks both. That was really, really thought-provoking. I'll take a lot of those ideas and thoughts back to where I sit on various trustee boards as well. So we've got a few questions come through, both in the chat function, and thanks to the participants that also submit questions in advance as well. We have a few along a similar theme, Sarah, which is all around how do you introduce or embed risk awareness culture within the charity. And a number of people have said, you know, historically that's either not been there or in the property of directors. So how do you get that embedded throughout the organisation?
Thanks, Jill. To be honest, I think it's about going back to basics with risk management. And we've always said from the very beginning that a lot of this comes from tone from the top. So we need to get the tone from the top right, but then also think about the day-to-day activities, the forums, the committees, teams, etc., that we all run and operate in our organisations. So consider risk, make it part of your agenda, gently cascade it, really, keep just making it part of the conversation and have that steady drumbeat so that we are thinking about risk in all parts of what we do, but without making it too formulaic, making it real for people. I think that really makes a difference.
Excellent, thank you. And a question around what are the key areas to monitor specifically for going concern purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's more one for you, Jill, but
well, you might pass that one back to
me. Thinking about it. I mean, from a risk management pure perspective, I might say, think about the risks on your risk register that have financial implications. And are you doing that what if scenario planning in respect of those sort of risks?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent, you know, as many of you on the call will know, a lot of time with our clients working through going concern as we've been signing off statutory accounts. And I know a lot of you have been doing financial reforecasts, and I had one client say to me, it's a bit like forecasting on sand. Everything keeps changing. We keep doing reforecasts and reforecasts. So I think that it really depends on what your charity does and what their sources of income are. I think if you're a fundraising charity, looking at the certainty of that fundraising pipeline and the risks around those income streams, I think is really important. I've been doing a lot of work with charities around reserves policies, and that's been a big area of focus for us, the risk profile of each of the individual income streams and how that's changed because of the pandemic. Cash flow, I've seen so many organisations really not do cash flow forecasts, and that's really been shifted. I think especially from the top, and you mentioned tone at the top, Sarah, a lot of charities now are being forced to do this because they have to keep a much closer eye on cash and cash flow, whereas previously, you know, they were in the luxury of not having to do that in many cases. And I think it's really good practice to keep an eye on that, just from a treasury management point of view, even if you are, you know, you have a huge number of investments which you can draw on, and reserves I touched on. So those would be my key areas. And of course, the other side to income is expenditure, you know, and I know a lot of charities are going through restructures at the moment, cost cutting, to be able to balance the books, not just this year, but going forwards as well, as we face the uncertainty that COVID brings on our business models. So I think those, for me, for going concern, those would be the key things. We have a similar question, actually, or a follow-on question from Michael. Ultimately, the trustees can be liable, and of course they can. How can the charity best ensure that it doesn't get to that?
Well, I think it's through having proper risk management processes in place and making sure that there is regular consideration of risk, regular debating of risk. I mean, there's so many committees that I go to where the risk register's on the agenda and everyone goes, yeah, you know, sort of thing. There's no real discussion or depth of discussion to it. And it tends to just have a few minutes. So the opportunity to really think about risk properly, and for trustees to feel assured, so that they get that assurance that the controls that they think are there to manage risk are actually working, is important.
Thank you. And Seema's just posted a question around the concept of monitoring risk velocity as the third variable is interesting.
Yes.
Can you expand on any examples of how you've seen this practically introduced onto the risk register?
I haven't actually seen any examples of it being practically introduced at this stage. It's something which seems to be a bit of a sort of a novel concept that people are just starting to get their heads around, really, just in response to the whole pandemic issue. I have seen a number of ways in which it's being kind of mathematically dealt with, i.e. do you multiply your impact by velocity to get and then add it to your probability, or do you do it the other way around? And I think at this stage it's very much a developing process. So I guess the simple answer for me is no, I haven't actually seen it done in practice yet, but I guess it's just a case of watch this space in terms of how people are developing it, and you know what BDO will do in terms of providing some guidance on it.
Thank you, Stuart. That's great. And Simon's posted one to me around cash flow. Have I seen a shift in the focus from historic management accounts to forward-looking good cash flow forecasts? At the charity where he's a trustee, there seems to have changed since the pandemic. I would absolutely agree. I think that is a general point I'm seeing across a number of charities, that forecasting and that future looking rather than that retrospective looking. Of course, ensuring that you have good financial forecasts, so based those good financial numbers rather to base those forecasts on is really important. But I would absolutely agree. I think what we're seeing is that financial pack becoming a lot more helpful and a lot more detailed in some cases with those cash flow forecasts going forward. I've got another question which came through in advance, which I think, again, I'll probably take the floor on. This was, when is it sensible to apply to de-restrict restricted reserves? Which is an interesting question we've been grappling with. And we've had various conversations with the Charity Commission on this. I think it's a delicate balance to navigate, because obviously you're governed by trust law in those cases. But what we have been seeing with those going concern assessments is that charities have inadvertently been using restricted funds over this period where cash is tight and reserves are tight to fund operating reserves and operating deficits. And you can't do that. So I think the question is well posed in that if you are planning or your forecasts are looking like you may get to that position, then to mitigate the risk, there's a number of things that you should be doing, including potentially going to the Charity Commission to try to de-restrict some of those restrictions. If you can't, in the first instance, contact the donor. So I think my advice on that would be to tread with caution on that. And make sure you're going through the right legalities of de-restricting rather than inadvertently using it, because you can get into trouble if you can't then repay them. So I think that's probably our time. I think we've got a couple of other questions, so apologies we haven't had a chance to get through to those, but what we will do is we will respond to you if we haven't had a chance to answer your question directly, and we'll respond to you either by email or with a phone call. So really it just leaves me to conclude, to thank both Sarah and Stuart for their session today, to thank everyone for joining us, to thank Hannah behind the scenes for coordinating all of this for us. And Hannah will also be sending out the recording to a feedback form for you as well. We really appreciate your feedback, so we can improve these sessions going forward. And any suggestions of topics that you would like us to cover in the next session, then please do let us know. That would be hugely valuable. So thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your day.